Hi everyone, kit number 9 from Stash Mountain is the 1 in 12 scale Astronaut in Space kit by Revell. The figurine depicted by the kit is of Ed White, who was the first American astronaut to do an EVA. This was part of the Gemini IV mission of June 3rd, 1965. On the sunny side, the kit did not have very many parts, so everything came together quickly and easily. All of the finer details, such as the folds in the spacesuit and the various parts of the equipment, were pretty good and looked nice when painted. The instruction sheet was well laid out, with lots of written instructions for building and painting during each step of the construction process. Using the umbilical cord and the door of the capsule as a base was pure genius and gave the finished model a unique look. On the shady side, the paint call-outs were very basic, which meant that online research to find reference pictures were vital to finish this build. There were a lot of seam lines and gaps which needed to be trimmed and filled, especially around the astronaut's boots. While I did think the base was amazing, it was quite perplexing at the same time, and it took quite a few tries to get it to work exactly the way it was supposed to. All things considered, this is a fun little kit for a weekend build, and looks pretty good once it's put together. I think it's fair to give this model a rating of 3 golden ostrich eggs. Admittedly, the figure itself was really awesome, but the base was a tough nut to crack. The front box art was a photograph of the actual model, and it came in quite handy a few times as a reference picture. All of the sprue trees were packed into a single plastic bag inside the box. The parts had quite a bit of flash to them, especially the smaller, more intricate bits of the model. On the other hand, these parts had a lot of fine surface detail, especially the cutout section of the Gemini space capsule. The visor for the helmet was not packed in a plastic bag with the other model parts, and was just packed loosely inside the box. This was a good thing, as it meant it would not rub against the bare plastic of other parts, and so it remained relatively scratch-free. As always, the parts were dunked into the kitchen sink and scrubbed with warm soapy water and a soft toothbrush. They were given a quick rinse with some cold water and gently patted dry using a kitchen towel to prevent any water stains. The sprue trees were laid out and given a quick once over with some Tamiya white primer. The base coat was applied in the back garden, as I don't use a spray booth, and the paint mist from the primer creates a fine dust which gets into everything, including one's precious lungs. After drying in the sun for about 15 minutes, the parts were packed up and ready to be assembled. I separated the sections which made up the astronaut's legs using sprue cutters, and carefully applied extra thin cement to glue the parts together. The soles of his boots were quite tricky, and I used a strategically placed scalpel blade to hold them into place while the glue cured. The arms were a little easier to work with, as the parts fit together more snugly. The gloves were quite a challenge, as the upper and lower parts of the fingers needed to be manipulated and eventually clamped together and allowed to cure overnight. Unfortunately, the assembled parts had extensive gaps and seam lines. The seam lines were scraped down carefully using a sharp X-Acto blade, followed by some strategic sanding. The gaps in the seam lines were filled with modeler's putty and sanded carefully too. After all of this damage control, the parts were given another quick spray of white base coat and examined to check for any further imperfections. A coat of gloss varnish was sprayed onto all of the parts. After it was dry, some light grey panel wash was painted onto all of the surfaces, and the excess was mopped up with a cotton bud. A final light coat of white paint was added using an airbrush, so that the spacesuit eventually had an appearance similar to one of the reference pictures of Edward II during that first spacewalk. Painting his face was a challenge. I started out with a dark tone for the initial coat and then did the eyes. The rest of the skin tone was slowly built up by blending lighter shades of paint to accentuate the highlights of the skin. It was a time-consuming process, but I was fairly happy with the way it eventually turned out. Some of the finer details of the suit were painted, including the harnesses of his suit, which received a coat of metallic blue. I decided to apply paint to the capsule using a paintbrush, as this would give it an uneven and hopefully more realistic flat aluminium finish. To start out, I gave it a base coat of gloss black paint. This was followed by a light coat of Tamiya flat aluminium, which I dry brushed across the whole surface of the Gemini capsule. After I was done with the painting, all of the surfaces which needed to be glued were cleaned with some acetone to remove any of the unwanted paint and varnish. This way, adhesive could be applied to a clean styrene surface and allow the parts to form a stronger bond. Finally, it was time to put the astronaut together. I used a thicker gel-type styrene adhesive for this job. This would create a stronger bond than the thin adhesive and allow the larger parts to be glued more firmly in place. The base of the model was the trickiest part of the build. I had to glue the door of the Gemini capsule to the cut-off section of its main body. It made sense that this would create a kind of base to display the model. However, this fact was not mentioned in the instructions, so I wasn't sure if this was actually the way things were intended to be. I cleaned the area carefully where the join would be made to expose as much pure styrene as possible. On the first few tries, I used the same gel-type adhesive from before and made sure to apply it quite liberally. It didn't work, as I couldn't get the model to balance properly, and eventually the whole thing toppled over and the door broke off. My last resort was to use some liquid steel epoxy, which is my usual go-to adhesive for resin models. After a couple of tries, I managed to get it to work. In fact, the whole structure balanced perfectly once everything was properly in place. This was quite a challenging model to put together, but I do like the way it turned out, so I'm not complaining about the small amount of extra effort the build entailed. And with that, I'm calling it done. So long, and thanks for watching.